I was asked about the mention of comedy and tragedy in the conclusion of Plato's Symposium. Now, Dr. Pierre Grimes has taught on this issue, and I did have an opportunity to discuss it with him some years ago. So what I will present in this video is my understanding of his teachings. I have to add, of course, the disclaimer that any errors are my own. Well, many of Plato's dialogues follow a familiar pattern. The introduction anticipates the main themes of the dialogue, and then you have the body in which the main themes are unfolded. And then the conclusion offers something that brings you to reflect on the whole dialogue in a new way. This video is going to focus on the conclusion of Plato's Symposium. The Symposium is arguably one of Plato's most famous works. This dialogue focuses on love, and it presents Socrates' famous ladder of beautiful objects, leading up to the divine vision of beauty itself. Yet, look at this section from the end of the dialogue. Then, as Aristodemus related, Eryximachus, Phaedrus, and some others took their leave and departed, while he himself fell asleep, and slumbered a great while, for the nights were long. He awoke towards dawn as the cocks were crowing, and immediately saw that all the company were either sleeping or gone, except Agathon, Aristophanes, and Socrates, who alone remained awake and were drinking out of a large vessel from left to right. And Socrates was arguing with them. As to most of the talk, Aristodemus had no recollection, for he had missed the beginning and was also rather drowsy. But the substance of it was, he said, that Socrates was driving them to the admission that the same man could have the knowledge required for writing comedy and tragedy, that the fully skilled tragedian could be a comedian as well. While they were being driven to this, and were but feebly following it, they began to nod. First Aristophanes dropped into a slumber, and then, as day began to dawn, Agathon also. When Socrates had seen them comfortable, he rose and went away. And so we need to ask ourselves, how does this ending stir us to reflect on a dialogue on love in a new way? What is the significance of this conversation about comedy and tragedy? And does it matter that Aristophanes, the comedian, fell asleep before the tragedian Agathon, and Socrates did not sleep at all? What does Socrates mean by stating that the fully skilled tragedian could be a comedian as well? To tackle this question, I'm going to add the philosopher Socrates to the pair. Now we have a three-term analogy. Comedy is to tragedy as tragedy is to philosophy. Now, a simple relationship we can see is that the Greeks gave us all three, and all three focused on love, and they did so in their own unique way. The Greek comedy of Plato's day was perhaps best exemplified by Aristophanes, who lampooned politicians and other high-ranking public figures. He famously lampooned Socrates in his play The Clouds, which can be found in English translation. Many comic plays of ancient Greece took the form of raunchy shorts that were dispersed between dramatic plays, and it is from this that we get the modern idea of comic relief. In regards to love, beauty, and happiness, we can see a progression from the shallow treatment of love in comedies in the form of sexuality, where beauty is reduced to sexual attraction, and happiness is reduced to physical pleasure. In tragedy, love is presented in a fragmented way, hindered by a focus on eliminating chaos. In line with this, beauty is distorted to an image of order. Happiness likewise is replaced, this time not by physical pleasure, but by a drive for success at achieving one's goals. For the philosopher, though, love and beauty are real. They are divine and mystical, and the attainment of true beauty is what brings genuine happiness. The philosopher sees the tragic protagonist's struggles as appearances only. The philosopher looks beyond those social images of success for a more profound fulfillment. The goal then is a spiritual one, and only by attaining such a goal can true happiness be found. Well, I am sure that there are many interesting points that can be made about Greek comedy and tragedy, but that is a topic for a different kind of YouTube channel. This is a philosophy channel, so I want to look at this topic philosophically. So let's come back to this analogy. We can rank these three in terms of cognitive functions. This is an adaptation of the divided line from Plato's Republic. It shows the cognitive functions from ignorance to knowledge. In comedy, the protagonists think they know. They never question it. They stumble along, getting into problems, but never really solving them. Yet they get through it. There is no learning and no growth, but they do get through it, and this allows the audience to laugh at them. The audience, of course, knows that they don't know, and so can take a certain pleasure in their ignorance. Well, we can put the protagonist of a comedy on our chart. This person is in two realms, ignorance and belief, because they are ignorant, but they believe that they know. And now the tragic figure. Tragic figures also think that they know, but these protagonists are more serious than their comic counterparts. They attempt to act intelligently in their situation, but there is always some key issue they never question. As the audience, we know this. Oedipus is the classic example of a Greek tragic figure. He never questioned that the man he killed on the road was old enough to be his father, and he never questioned that the woman he married was old enough to be his mother. And so it is with all tragic figures. There is something important that they are ignorant about. The audience knows this and feels empathy for this. They watch to see how this person deals with the resulting chaos, and as the audience were perhaps moved by this person's integrity and courage. The chaos is always a direct result of his ignorance, but despite his intelligence, he doesn't know this until he is faced with the results of that ignorance and is forced to reckon with it. Unlike the comic figure, the tragic figure does learn and does grow. This figure then would rise a little higher on our chart. The tragic protagonist has ignorance and unquestioned belief, but also gains some understanding by the end of the story. And what about the philosopher? The Socratic figure also expresses ignorance and belief, but the difference is that he recognizes his ignorance and is not content with it. Also, he constantly questions his beliefs. He is driven by the desire to know thyself. He is always working to uncover false beliefs about himself and about the nature of reality. Like the tragic protagonist, the philosopher wants to master chaos. But the tragic protagonist wants to master the chaos that is around him. The philosopher, on the other hand, seeks to master the chaos within himself. So looking at our chart, we see that philosophers go through all 4 stages of cognitive functioning. They start in ignorance, but then they question beliefs. They develop understanding of themselves and of reality. And that is still not the end of their journey, for they must ultimately experience reality itself and know it for themselves through direct experience. This separates the philosopher from the other 2. Unlike the comic and tragic figures, the philosopher ultimately has no audience. We can understand the comic figure easily enough. And even though we have not suffered the same trauma as the tragic figure, we can certainly sympathize with him. The philosophical figure is different, though. We can read about Socrates, but we have to become a philosopher ourselves in order to truly understand his journey. Without direct knowing for ourselves what Plato calls in the Symposium the perfection of beauty, our understanding of the philosopher's journey is greatly hindered. And so now we have to ask ourselves, how does any of this help us reflect on the Symposium in a new way? What we see from this chart is that neither the comedian nor the tragedian believes that true knowing is possible. Only the philosopher does, and only the philosopher even reaches for it. Aristophanes, who was a comic playwright, gave a speech about love in which humans are split in half. According to his story, humans used to have double the limbs and other body parts, but were split in half by Zeus for conspiring against the gods. As a result, we spend our lives looking for our missing half without knowing what truly drives us. These are they who continue together throughout life, though they could not even say what they would have of one another. Obviously, the soul of each is wishing for something else that it cannot express, only divining and darkly hinting what it wishes. And so this comedian wrote a tragic story, and it's one that ultimately fails, in which love, this aching for our missing half, results from a punishment. The cause of it all is this, that our original form was as I have described, and we were entire. And the craving and pursuit of that entirety is called love. And what of Agathon's speech about love? At the end of his speech in praise of love, Agathon, who was an award-winning tragedian, says this: "There, Phaedrus, is the speech I would offer at love's shrine. I have done my best to mingle amusement with a decent gravity." So he tried to make a speech that offered elements of comedy, along with what he calls a decent gravity. Let's see how well he did. He makes the claim that love is the most beautiful and the best of the gods, and so the happiest. "So I say that, while all the gods are blissful, love, with no irreverence or offense be it spoken, is the most blissful, as being the most beautiful and the best." Yet he never proves his thesis, and his images of love are stunted by earthly values and judgments. Here's just a piece of his lengthy conclusion. "Father of luxury, tenderness, elegance, graces, and longing and yearning, careful of the good, careless of the bad, in toil and fear, in drink and discourse, our trustiest helmsman, boatswain, champion, deliverer, ornament of all gods and men, leader fairest and best, whom everyone should follow, joining tunefully in the burthen of his song, wherewith he enchants the thoughts of every god and man. Basically, every positive thing imaginable was thrown together into this conclusion of a speech that was neither comic nor tragic, and it actually made no sense. Socrates pointed this out himself at the close of Agathon's speech. Says Socrates, "I was ignorant of the method in which eulogies ought to be made at all, for I was such a silly wretch as to think that one ought in each case to speak the truth about the person eulogized. But now it appears that this is not what is meant by a good speech of praise, which is rather an ascription of all the highest and fairest qualities, whether the case be so or not. It is really no matter if they are untrue." And this points to the conflict that inevitably persists between the philosopher and the tragedian. Philosophers sacrifice order and success in the physical world. These things are of no concern. Philosophers are doing something else. Yet order and success are what is most important to the tragedian. The person coming from such a value system does not understand the philosopher. The philosopher alone knows that the nature of reality is beauty itself. The slightest inkling of this beauty awakens a true love in the soul. Therefore, the Symposium offers us a model for knowing. As readers, we can understand this, but we cannot directly know it without taking on the challenge of philosophy for ourselves. Now I want to return to the quote I opened this video with, from the conclusion of the dialogue. "All the company were either sleeping or gone, except Agathon, Aristophanes, and Socrates, who alone remained awake and were drinking out of a large vessel, from left to right, and Socrates was arguing with them. As to most of the talk, Aristodemus had no recollection, for he had missed the beginning and was also rather drowsy. But the substance of it was, he said, that Socrates was driving them to the admission that the same man could have the knowledge required for writing comedy and tragedy, that the fully skilled tragedian could be a comedian as well." Why can the tragedian write comedy as well? What we see here is that using these three people to represent their respective arts, all three of them experience ignorance and belief. Therefore, they can all express them. However, the comedian does not have understanding. The comedian cannot write tragedy, but the tragedian can write comedy. Both Aristophanes and Agathon were reluctant to admit this. It is easy enough to see why the comedian would object. For Agathon, this was perhaps an even harder pill to swallow. His failure at comedy throws into question his abilities as a tragedian, too. And beyond both is the philosopher. Only the philosopher experiences all four cognitive functions. And so it is philosophy alone that forces us to re-examine our notions of love, of beauty, and of happiness.